Welcome to KO Stories, where I tell stories of the mysterious, twisted, and paranormal. And today is no different. I got a really good story for you guys. So, without any further ado, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Welcome everybody, I got a crazy story for you today, but if you can just do me a favor real quick. Now, as you know, this is my channel, KO Stories, but I also created a new channel about a month ago, and it's called MTP Stories, and if you would as well, please go subscribe to that one, because this channel will still remain live, but eventually it's going to turn into a different type of channel. My main stories going forward will be on MTP Stories. Now, I will repeat this for the next couple of stories, that way everybody gets to go over there, but still stay subscribed to this, because I will have either music or some other cool thing, or maybe even more stories on this as well. So without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. Now, if you're at home watching this, I know there might not be anybody around, but raise your hand if you've ever heard of skin hunting. Go ahead, raise your hand. How many of you raised your hand? Well, okay. This is the practice among Polish ambulance crews, and they take bribes from funeral homes in exchange for information about the recently deceased. So, the funeral home would then contact the family of the deceased to offer their services before any of their competitors had a chance to do so. Do you get it? And in the majority of cases, the relatives would use that funeral home, and the funeral home would then claim a tariff of $1,000 from the state, and then it kicked back a finder's fee of $200 to the medic, which was nearly a third of their monthly salary for a typical Polish emergency doctor. Now, for the workers, it was a convenient but immoral arrangement. And as with any trade where money has become the primary motivator, this one, just like any other, was ripe for corruption. So basically it started off like this. These ambulance crews and emergency medical staff would, just pass on information about patients that just died. But of course, it wasn't too long before some began to realize that more corpses meant more money. And then there were certain medics that began to carry out their own life-saving efforts with less diligence than the job required. Plus, there were others that deliberately took their time, whether it was to reach the hospital and making unnecessary detours and even stopping by the roadside in the hope that their patient would be pronounced dead on arrival. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, emergency doctors who rode with the ambulance crew sometimes failed to attempt to resuscitate their patient. And even if they did it half-heartedly. Now, it got bad to the point where sometimes they even withheld life-saving drugs, all in the name of making a quick buck. Now, these practices became widespread, and it seemed possible that the authorities knew nothing about it. But in hindsight now, there is indeed strong evidence to suggest that both medical and police establishments were actually aware of this skin hunting trade, and why they failed to act is uncertain. Although prosecutors may well have weighed up the odds of successfully trying these cases and decided that they were significantly stacked against them, so they didn't do it. And the medical authorities would have also realized that a public admission to this practice of skin hunting would have seriously undermined the credibility of their emergency services. And, these could be the reasons why nothing was done. But like most corruption, the authorities could only turn a blind eye for so long, because eventually a case came to light where the perpetrators were so bold and brazen that the police were actually forced to finally take action. Okay, so in 1995, the police in Lodz, which was Poland's second largest city, were tipped off about an ambulance dispatcher at one of the city's largest hospitals and this man reportedly was the ringleader of a group of skin hunters with virtually every emergency medic at the hospital on his payroll. And he was totally blatant about his activities, and he would openly boast about the money he was making, and he slipped up when trying to recruit a recently qualified EMT, and the young paramedic had been outraged at the offer of cash for corpses and then contacted police. It's good to know that some people out there still have morals. But you see, the investigation into this case was very badly mishandled, and some suggested that it was handled that way deliberately. So rather than, place the suspect under surveillance while they gathered evidence, the police arrested the dispatcher on the spot. And of course, he denied any wrongdoing, and despite holding him in custody for a month, the police eventually were forced to release him because of a lack of evidence. And believe it or not, he even tried to return to his job, although the hospital wisely decided not to re-employ him. Now, after that, the investigation into the skin hunting trade went quiet. But of course, that didn't mean that the problem went away. Not even a little. In fact, it had taken an even more sinister turn, because now there were certain crews that were not only allowing patients to die, but they were actively causing their deaths using the muscle relaxant Pavilon. And this drug was commonly used to stop a patient's breathing when he or she is to be placed on a ventilator. And without that ventilator, the patient would quickly suffocate as the lungs were unable to even draw a breath. Now, this is sad because it is a very unpleasant way to die. And to top things off, the patient remains lucid throughout the whole thing, unable to move a muscle, though he is aware, or she is aware, that death is imminent, and they are absolutely powerless to do a thing about it. Now, how long this horrendous practice of cash for corpses may have continued is open to conjecture. But in 2002, an investigative journalist from Gazeta Wyborcza, Poland's largest newspaper, published a story exposing the horrendous details of the skin hunters. And not only skin hunters, but the skin hunting trade. And although the practice was rampant throughout all of Poland, the article focused on Lodz. Now, this was because they believed that that was the city that was the most affected by it. Now, the result of this was widespread public outcry for the authorities to finally take some action. But once again, the investigation was done half-hearted, despite the article reporting the involvement of hundreds of healthcare workers in what appeared to be none other than malpractice and murder. Now, the police honed in on only one crew consisting of paramedics Andrzej Nowicki and Karol Banasiwi. I know I butchered those names, guys. And also emergency doctors Janusz Kalinski and Paweł Wisniewski. And even then, the evidence was still scarce. It was almost impossible to determine who the victims were and which patients had died naturally and which had been helped on their way to the other side. Also, which had died due to inadequate medical assistance, which had been injected with Pavilon, a drug that is notoriously difficult to detect. And to be perfectly honest, if the accused would have just kept their mouths shut, they probably would have walked away scot-free. But Nowicki and Banasiwi decided to come clean and admit their involvement in the horrible scheme. Now, they would eventually be tried in January 2007, with Nowicki sentenced to life in prison for 4 murders, and Banasiwi received 25 years in prison for particularly one cruel murder of a patient. Now, Dr. Kalinski was found guilty of willfully endangering 10 patients and sentenced to 6 years with his medical license suspended for 10 years, and the other doctor, Wisniewski, was convicted of a similar offense and received 5 years in prison with a suspension of 10 years, and all the sentences were upheld upon appeal. But the reign over the horrendous practice of skin hunting did not end there. In fact, the newspaper that had published the expose received more criticism than the medical fraternity itself. And the Gazeta Wyborska was widely condemned for slandering the names and reputations of hardworking and underpaid ambulance staff. And while the inquiry by the district prosecutor's office in Lodz continued, they would eventually examine over 800 cases without making one single arrest. Then, on December 31st, 2010, the public prosecutor announced that a decision had been taken to discontinue the investigation into the movement of ambulances. Failing some new significant disclosure, it's unlikely that it will ever be resumed. So, not really a crazy end to the story, but the moral of this story is that if you go to Poland, try not to end up in the back of an ambulance, because it seems like for some EMTs, you are more important to them dead than alive. I really hope you guys enjoyed this story, and like I said, please also subscribe to MTP Stories right now. I'll give you a second. Thank you. In fact, just do it once you wrap up here. But if you're still in the mood to watch more, go to MTP Stories or click on the screen right here. I appreciate y'all, I love y'all, and I'll see you later.